We've been talking about modern Indian art and modern art in general. I think there's a confusion between modernist art and, in fact, modernity in a wider sense. Let's take Indian art, for example. Indian art encountered modernism around 1920s. Now here I want to make one thing very clear, that modernism is a discourse which emerged in the perhaps late 19th century and affected all the arts and literature. It's a form of challenging tradition. So that's modernism as a discourse. Modernity is part of larger forces that actually really kind of prevailed in the 19th century. Modernity has a lot to do with European expansion outside the West, and it deals with great transport revolution, steamship, steam engine, all sorts of things, as well as communication revolution, telegraph and so on, but also print technology that actually spread knowledge across the world. Also, mustn't forget, as part of the great changes of modernity, was that there were great population movements around the world. I would say these are the three things that are the hallmarks of modernity. India was a traditional society before its occupation by the British, which was in the late 18th century. But by mid-19th century, the British Raj and the East India Company began to think seriously about changing Indian taste. Especially the Victorians believed that inculcation of good taste, instruction in good taste, was the duty of the British rulers towards the Indian subjects. So there was there was a revolution in the whole art institutions from the 1850s. Originally, Indians, especially Indian artists, were trained by masters, and they worked in smaller groups, workshops, and they worked for their aristocratic patrons. This was changed totally when art schools came into existence on the English model. So that's one way that European naturalist representational art came to India. Secondly, this sort of art, oil painting, landscapes, portraits, and history painting, they were diffused through art societies. Art societies played a very important role in colonial India in the 19th century. They were supported by the British, and they displayed the works of Europeans, but also Indians. And then you had the rise of, newspapers, journalism, and art journalism also began to emerge. All these things led to the creation of a, you might say, art-conscious public. So, third element, the final element, you might say, was mechanical reproductions, mass prints. Art schools and art societies were for the bourgeoisie, for the middle classes, for the elite. But mass prints reached the masses, ordinary people. So these things came together. So by the end of the 19th century, beginning of 1900, let's say, India was thoroughly Victorian in taste. So these are the great revolutionary changes that took place. So I've called this early period from the 1850s to 1900 as age of optimism, somewhat ironically. By that I mean that naturalism, academic art, particularly academic art, 9th century, was embraced by Indians, the poor and the rich alike. But around 1900, there was a counter tendency. This is because of all sorts of reasons, particularly political reasons. There was a movement among Asian nations which had been culturally dominated by the West. So Japan and India began to offer a kind of cultural resistance. Rabindranath Tagore, the great Indian poet, and Okakura Kakuzo, Japanese intellectuals, they came together. Okakura came to Calcutta, stayed with the Tagores, creating what was called Pan-Asian movement, which was a form of response to Western, as they said, materialism and Western technology and progress, to see that superior. But these people challenged this idea and said no. Asian spirituality was in fact superior to European materialism. So this kind of Pan-Asianism had tremendous impact on nationalist art. So nationalist art began to emerge. It was led by Rabindranath Tagore, a young Indian artist, nephew of the poet Rabindranath Tagore. And he was also kind of inspired by an English art teacher, E.B. Havell. So together they created this new nationalist art movement in India. But Rabindranath gathered a whole lot of young students around him to try and kind of excavate ancient art, try and rediscover ancient Indian art. So that was a big change. Now, 1920s, that's the time when India again was undergoing tremendous changes. 1918, Mahatma Gandhi, who took charge of leadership of Indian nationalist movement, and he first time made, you might say, middle-class Indians aware of the peasant, the ordinary people. Also, this is the time when the elite intellectuals discovered not only folk art, you might say popular art, such as art of Kalighat. It was a cheap form of painting done by a whole lot of, workers for the Pilgrim Center in Kalighat in Calcutta. That suddenly kind of became the vogue in the 1920s. And along with that, there was a sort of slow discovery, again among the Indian elite, of the tribals, who had until now been neglected by settled societies. And the British anthropologists began to study tribals. All this led to a new idea, I call it primitivism, in a very specific sense. New belief that these tribals and folk people, they are the true Indians, the really children of the soil. And if you were to, achieve national identity and independence, you had to look towards them. So that had a tremendous impact on new generation of artists, because at this time, also around about 1920, 21, Cubism was discovered by Indian artists, but also 1922 there was a very famous exhibition of the Bauhaus artists in Calcutta that brought Kandinsky, Klee and others to Calcutta. So that was a revelation. As you know, it is known that Kandinsky and others challenged Western academic art, and they did go back to Kandinsky went back to Russian peasantry. So all these things had tremendous impact on Indian painters, and Indians themselves were developing ideas about primitivism. I call it primitivism. It was a form of resistance to British colonial capitalist structure, and that was a global thing. And so what they were doing, this critical modernity, believed that we had to go back to the village, to the community. And Jamira, one of the great painters of that generation, 1920s and 30s, although he lived up to 1970s, strongly supported the idea that you had to create a collective or communal art which had been destroyed by colonial rule. So this is where you see the link between modernism, yes, formalist modernism coming into India, simplicity, boldness, that got wedded to this idea of the simple peasant and the tribals, who were romanticized, idealized. Now, recently, there have been a lot of exposure in the West of non-Western art and non-Western artists, not only classical art, ancient Hindu temple art, or Islamic or Indian miniatures, but also Indian, Asian, and non-Western modernist works. There's a whole range of works. Now, there have been rather interesting attempts at the Tate, at the Centre Pompidou and other places to show non-Western artists. And they've been very interesting, successful experiments. But the point I want to make is that if you show these artists from outside the West, just place them against the wall and then let people appreciate their formal qualities, color, line, etc., I don't think it works. In a long time ago, I suppose bad old days, old museums always had this notion of masterpieces, quality of works of art, and these were displayed without any explanation at all. I do think that a lot of people felt lost, and they did complain that there was nothing, there for them to hold on to, as it were, intellectually. But more recent exhibitions have been much more contextual. I think to understand any art movement that is either Western or Eastern, wherever, these movements belong to certain historical moments. They have a certain background, cultural background. I mean, modernism or the avant-garde often is a form of challenge to traditional art. If you didn't know what the history was, what the tradition was, and what they were trying to do, how would you appreciate these artists? So that's why I think it's a very important thing that exhibitions, particularly global art exhibition, should contextualize these artists to give the audience a sense of what these are about. And I think these do work. I've seen in a lot of cases. They have been, very successful. People enjoy reading about them and then looking at them. Yes, how do we do global museum? How do we do big exhibitions of global art or art from all over the world? In the West, particularly, we're thinking, or but anywhere else. Now, it's a difficult question. The thing is that all the different modernisms, modernism is in a way seen as one Western modernism, but this isn't true. Western modernism was the first, and it did set certain rules, laid down certain rules, but nonetheless, when you go to different countries, their modernisms were always related to their own cultural needs. So if you are going to show, I don't know, anything, Hungarian art, Chinese art, Indian art, what have you, you need to think about how you could do it. One way could be that you have different, it's a collaborative project. You have to have different curators planning this with each one taking a region and doing a micro history of the region. But then what is the connecting link? Why should one, we can just go into a museum, or art gallery and look at an exhibition, all the different regions that place next to each other. So what's the common, factor in these different forms of modernism? What is interesting, if you think carefully, particularly in the 20th century, there were these very, very much larger events, political, economic, particularly political and social, as well as cultural events, which provided thread to all these different forms of modernism. The two great wars, of course, or colonialism, as a very important thread, and resistance. Then things like, to take an example, the year 1905, Einstein's relativity theory was propounded, was public knowledge. Japan, Asian country, first time defeated European country, Russia, and then there was the first Russian Revolution, I think the first one, in the 20th century, and a number of things happened in that period which really affect a whole range of countries, Europe and Asia. And then you have these nationalist movements in various parts of the world. They're linked because colonialism and nationalism are really twins, two sides of a coin. Therefore, when you're looking at Europe, you're also looking at outside Europe. So these you need to think about to really create a meaningful exhibition.